Um, the theme of the panel is economic development. We've got a very good group here. To my left, Andrew Kimball, who for the last number of years has been very successful in building up the Brooklyn Navy Yard and is now moved over to a major real estate company where hopefully he's going to take some of what he learned at the Navy Yard and do it there. Next to him, another Kimball, no relation, Kyle. Kyle Kimball has been at the City Economic Development Corporation for a while, and he is now running it in these fading days of the Bloomberg administration. And so it's I'm amazed that he could take an hour to be here today because he has a lot to accomplish before December 31st. Stuart Applebaum, who, as most of you know, is head of the National Retailers Union and has many other roles to play, and is active in the economic jobs and quality jobs sphere. Ellen West is the face of Google in New York City, and probably if we think about who's done more than anything in the past 5 years to have an impact on our city economy, it is probably Google's move and putting over 1,000 people in the heart of Midtown South. So she's going to talk a little bit about that. Cliff Chenfield is an entrepreneur, a successful business builder in New York City, and he has been working with us on organizing the city's entrepreneurs, whom we at the partnership have felt have not been adequately represented in the public policy debate, and yet they are the biggest job creators. So Cliff is here, and finally Maria Gotch, who is at the partnership president and CEO of the fund, the Partnership Fund for New York City, which is a resource that we hope you will all think of as investing in both the future of the city economy and in building the economies of our communities. So Maria can talk a little bit about that. I just wanted to say in opening that economic development, real estate development, community development are related but are not the same thing. And so we've got a panel on real estate coming up, and in the talking about economic development and business development, I think what we want to talk about are some of the things that Dick Parsons raised, but in my own experience, the council has serious authority in the real estate land use area, so on real estate development. But there's very little authority with which that the council has with regard to the economic climate and building business, except negative. And what I hope some of you will think about in terms of your questions and talking is what can we do together constructively with the entrepreneurs and small business, with the corporate community? What are the things that we ought to be thinking about doing constructively that we can engage the council in a positive way to help create jobs and build the economy? Because it's not written into your charter anyplace. It's not land use. It's much more than that. So that's just what I want to project to you is the issue I'm interested in. I spend a lot of time thinking about it, and probably the people here do too. So the theme of this panel was strengths and vulnerabilities of the city economy, and in that context, I'm just going to ask each of these people who are knowledgeable in their own right to say a few words about what they think are most important about the strengths we have in place to build on and the vulnerabilities, weaknesses, or gaps that we need to think about, and maybe the council could, maybe it could be part of the council's agenda to think about when we think about where we're vulnerable, where we're weak, what are some of the things that council members might be thinking about that they could do to contribute? So, Andrew, you're a smart guy, you start.
Okay. Well, I'm going to take a couple of liberties because I think it's informative to the new council members to hear a little bit about the kind of coalition building, the support that I got in redeveloping the Navy Yard, because a lot of those folks are in the room today. So one of the key things was convincing the city that we had a business model that worked, targeting the right sectors of what I call the innovation economy. So the broad range of making a physical, digital, or engineered product. Definitions are so important. All of you are going to see lots of charts and graphs that continue to show manufacturing declining. But if you really dig into that, those are done by the Department of Labor, and it's 1950s vision of manufacturing. When you look at another chart and you see film and television going straight up like this, every manufacturing advocate in the city recognizes that film and television are a key manufacturing sector in the city. Arts and culture, $1 billion of art was getting worked on at the Navy Yard, sets getting built for all the cultural institutions. Everybody acknowledges that arts and culture are critical to tourism, manufacturing growing in New York City, but not picked up in the Department of Labor stats. So that's just one point I want to highlight. We went to the city, and you guys all heard from Michael Daugherty in the previous panel. Well, he was one of the key players I went to in addition to the deputy mayor, and you can tell Michael Daugherty is a pretty tough guy, and we had to show a business model that would work with a strong return, both in terms of job creation, but in terms of revenue to rebuild the Navy Yard, and that's what got the birth of the Navy Yard, the rebirth over the last 10 years really going. So $200 million of city-funded investment that leveraged over $750 million of private investment, 2 million square feet of space, 3,000 jobs with another 5,000 on the way. Then it was, how do we figure out how to link with the community to make sure as many of those jobs that are good paying jobs go to the community? And Tony Ewell was one of the key board members there from Con Ed, the head of our community relations committee, really supported me in coming to the city council and saying, with your discretionary capital dollars, will you help me build an employment center? Because we do a little bit of this pre-screening and placing from the community, but we think we can do a lot more if we really engage in the community. We're walled off. We want to open up. We raised $15 million, city, state, and federal, but a big chunk came from the city council. We've placed 1,000 people in jobs, at least up until July when I left, over the last 5 years. 25% of them NYCHA residents, 12% formerly incarcerated, 10% veterans. Exactly the kinds of jobs that the new mayor is talking about and that we need to move the city forward. These are jobs that pay 25 to 40% more than the service sector, job at McDonald's, a job in a hotel. So those are just some of the ways we worked on the people in the room. Once the city stepped in, the state really stepped up, thanks to Stuart and Kathy on the Regional Economic Development Council. That really drove the growth of the entertainment and media business that's just exploding in the city, a business that is subsidized through tax credits from the state, but I would argue a very, very effective tax credit. So that is a small example of a huge opportunity for the city going forward. I think both a challenge and an opportunity is how do we model the Brooklyn Navy Yard elsewhere? Some of the things that were successful about it were that every dollar that we made at the Brooklyn Navy Yard got invested right back in that site. So how can we do that elsewhere in the city? How can we identify other not-for-profits that are doing really good work in this space? I would submit that the Greenpoint Manufacturing Design Center is the perfect example of a not-for-profit that in mixed-use areas is creating these kinds of good-paying new manufacturing jobs. I also think that the private sector is starting to get it, and there's a key opportunity for the council to support the private sector. I'm obviously self-interested in that, and one of Jamestown's properties is Sunset Park, 6 million square feet of space, wildly underutilized for 30 years. We're trying to bring it back to life and create 10,000 jobs. So how, through zoning and incentives, do we drive that? Why don't I stop there?
Good. I'm going to move to Ellen to talk a little bit about how Google saw the city and what brought them here.
So our growth as a tech company here is actually accidental, and I'll explain why. We started our advertising business here in 2000, actually out of a Starbucks at 86th and Columbus, because the founders of Google weren't convinced we could make any money from advertising, so they didn't want us to commit to office space in New York. It's a true story. Eventually, the advertising business took off, and we always knew we'd have a presence here, but our tech presence has been an unexpected thing. And to correct a figure Kathy gave, we're actually now closing in on 4,000 employees in New York. So we're, in the 7 years I've been at Google, we've gone from 400 to 4,000. The accidental aspect is having software engineers here, which we never anticipated, and happened literally because one of our founding engineers in California didn't like living in California, and he'd been a professor
Yes.
at Rutgers. And he said, I love Google, I love software engineering, but I got to get back to New York City. And that's a key theme of what I'm going to say. He missed the diversity of New York. He missed the culture of New York. He missed the proximity to the design community in his spare time. He's a designer. He wanted to be here. And so Larry and Sergey said, well, we don't think there are any good engineers in New York, but we like you, so we're going to give you a year. And if you can find 15 talented engineers, we'll let you open an engineering office. Today we have 1,500 talented engineers. What did we discover? New York City has a long, rich history in technology. I was at an event the other night. This is where Tesla and Edison battled it out for who was going to create an electrical grid. This is where Bell Labs first started. This region is where IBM got going. So we found there was this rich technical heritage in New York that nobody in New York was talking about. So we began talking about it. We also found there was rich talent on Wall Street, only it was hidden in the back offices. So we began luring people up to Chelsea. And it just sort of snowballed from there. I think what's helped us to grow and what this administration has done, two things. One, just be a champion for tech. I think the mayor and the EDC made everyone believe we could do it. In fact, making us believe we could do it, that we could play a role in growing the ecosystem here. And I think the second thing is that ecosystem point. What is missing from the equation? And the Applied Sciences Initiative was an important part of that, having a graduate level school of engineering that would attract talent. What's missing now is the other end of the pipeline. Students coming out of, as Dick Parsons said this morning, New York City schools who are interested and motivated to work in tech companies. We can kind of keep this going for a few years. We still are hiring as much talent as we can find. But frankly, we're now New Yorkers. We own a building in New York, which I don't think we understood what that would, owning real estate in New York would do to us. Again, we kind of did it because we liked the building and we liked being here. But we're here for the long run, but we are concerned about wanting to be part of New York. And that means helping the city's children see futures for themselves in the tech industry. And so that's very much what we would like to see. And I think the other thing is the investment in a livable city, the green spaces. I mean, these are important amenities to people in the tech sector. Being able to bike to work, being able to use public transit. These are important values to our employees. Having a vibrant waterfront, important to our employees. The High Line has been very important to the area we live and work in. So I think that's what we want to see, the continued emphasis on creative ways to keep New York livable and green, and helping us build a good pipeline so that Google New York continues to look like New York for people who don't want to live in California.
Stuart, do you want to chime in and talk a little bit about your view of the economy?
Sure. I think the first thing I want to say is actually something about Kathy, that Kathy is one of the smartest and most effective people I've come across in New York. And
Unpaid commercial.
no, it's an unpaid commercial. And I think that what's important about that is that I've had the opportunity to find that out, that we talk to each other, we communicate. Recently, an author came in for a book event that Kathy sponsored about what makes a difference for different metropolitan areas. And one of the prime differences he noted in an area's success is when people from different components of the economy come and talk together and they realize how much they have in common, how much they share, and the common objectives they have. Kathy and I work together on the Regional Economic Development Council, which Governor Cuomo appointed, and which Suri Deutsch from CUNY, who's here, has been an important linchpin of for the last few years. And it brings together people from academia, it brings together people from business, labor, and government to all work together and to look at the economy in a strategic way, not just look for areas where we may be able to do something good, but it's not going to lead to anything, not going to build. I see my role on that as being a workers' advocate. And I think that as a group, what we've decided on is that we want not just jobs being developed, but that we want good jobs being developed. I think the new notion of economic development is not just creating jobs, but jobs that don't keep people in poverty and provide wages where they can survive in the city. The vulnerability we have, the major vulnerability we have in the city is something that was the focus of the last campaign, and that's income inequality. We've heard the statistics that 45% of the people of New York live either in poverty or near poverty, and that's unsustainable. Someone gave me a figure that said in 1980, the top 1% of New Yorkers claimed 12% of the city's total income. And today, that 12% is now 39%. So we have to find ways where we're able to make sure that the economy is going to work for all people in the city, that we have to find good jobs. Now, if you were asking me, I would say the best way to do that is to find vehicles for collective action by workers. I would like to see notions of maybe labor neutrality and labor peace in economic development, because I believe that deals better than just about anything else with the problem of income inequality. I'll tell you one other vulnerability I think we have in the city, and the problem is the state. There are things we want to do as a city that are curtailed by the state. If we want to increase the minimum wage in New York, the state plays a role in that, and the question is whether or not we even have the ability to do that. And we also have to look at what happens to the money from the state. Power isn't the only thing that flows out of the city and up to Albany. More devastating is our ability to govern the tax revenues that are generated here in relation to what we give to Albany and what Albany gives back to us. City residents and businesses paid about $4.1 billion more to Albany in taxes and fees than the state returned in spending for education, health care, transit, and other services. For the last year I've seen the measurement made, which was 2009-2010. So we have strengths. People from California want to move here, and who can blame them? People in New York love talking and talking to each other. We're taking a strategic approach to what we do in the economy, but our greatest vulnerability is making sure that the economy works for all of us in New York City.
Absolutely. Kyle, maybe you want to add something, particularly about the limitations that we of a city have on our own economy and resources and programs, because we are so much in the throes of what the state wants to do.
Sure. It's interesting, you know, in some ways, the book I think you were talking about was the Bruce Katz book, I believe.
Yes.
And so the Bruce Katz has an idea of sort of the metropolitan revolution, where you know, cities are really stepping into a role, and a much more powerful role, in the absence of a federal government really doing anything, and that true governance is happening at the local level. And I would say that's actually somewhat true even in the city and state relationship with respect to economic development. We, in some ways, are very different entities in that most economic development is left to the city. There are certain projects where we have partnered with the state to, whether or not it be for land use in the case of Atlantic Yards, or we've actually taken over a project from the state in the case of Governor's Island and Brooklyn Bridge Park. But what's interesting is, in some ways, I would say the Regional Economic Council is one of the exceptions, which has been a great exception, and it's been a great addition to the economic development scene here in the city. But in many ways, we have taken a go-it-alone strategy with respect to economic development, and have our own strategies with respect to that. I would say, secondly, one of the organizations that has been helpful, although controversial, is the IDA, which is a state entity that's actually created by the city. It's created by the state, but staffed by the city. In 2008, it lost its ability to do tax-exempt bonding for certain types of institutions, namely not-for-profits, which play a huge role in the city in terms of its economy. And in some cases, the access to cheap financing is really what helps a not-for-profit or a marginal type of organization that qualifies, gives them an opportunity to do some sort of project. And that's something that the state really just never took up again. And so we had to create a new entity here in the city called Build NYC to really step in and take over those responsibilities. So it's been an interesting journey, I think, in terms of economic development with respect to the state. But I would say in many ways, we have sort of been focused on self-determination with respect to economic development. We have partnered in certain circumstances, and in some cases, the state has been incredibly helpful in getting economic development through. So it's been an interesting journey.
But the tax policies and others that, at least from a business standpoint, are most important, are all driven by the state.
Are all driven by the state.
And as a result, it's not like you can sit down and make a city plan and then implement. Let me conclude with Maria as an investor in job creation and Cliff as a representative of a job creator in the entrepreneurial community, to each say a few words about sort of what they see as the frustrations of job creators in the city, and any thoughts they have about the role of the council in a positive way to help with that. Maria, why don't you start, because I always send Maria to deal with the issue at the city council hearings.
So I'm going to answer that sort of with two different groups. There are, I guess I would say, neighborhood businesses, and then there are growth tech businesses. And while they're all run by entrepreneurs, and you should applaud them because they're taking risks, they're not sure of their paycheck, and they're typically very resourceful people, they tend to have different issues and look at the world a little bit differently. And I think as you think about how do you help business, it shouldn't be business. It should be sort of with some nuances around what the specific needs are. So small neighborhood businesses tend to be more focused on place, their immediate neighborhood, and they need capital, they need talent, and they need customers. Same with the growth businesses, but sort of in a different order. So in a small business, the talent tends to be the owner of the store, and they need customers, so they need a sort of a safe place, they need security, they need transportation. And so because they're more place-based, government regulation tends to sort of is something they interact with. So permitting, fees, they have to deal with the fire department, all of those things which they're all sort of ginned up, ready to go. They want to start their business, they have a great idea, and then they have to spend a long time and money before they can even start to do that, and then forget even getting customers who provide revenue. So it's sort of a key thing for city government, and I know the Bloomberg administration's done a good job of sort of looking at this and how can you streamline that process and not give up the security that you need and make sure people are doing what they're supposed to do, but give them a path to do it more efficiently and to save time, and that saves them money. So that, from a kind of a neighborhood business, is sort of the key things to think about. When it comes to tech businesses, I think they're much less about the place. Before we started, asked Cliff how often he had interacted with city council. He said not much. They're more place agnostic, and so they think about not what specific neighborhood should I be in the immediate sort of area. They're thinking about, should I be in Boston? Should I be in California? Should I be in Austin? And so the quality of life issues that Ellen went through are really what they think about. And they also think about talent. And so I know that sort of the CUNY system is one that the City Council spends a lot of, they provide funding and pay attention to. So making sure that CUNY has the resources and the focus that the training that they're providing the CUNY students is the right training, that it's not how do you do computer programming from 10 years ago, it's how do you do computer programming today. Because that sort of is the number one issue when you talk to growth tech companies is I need, before I can even sell my software, I have to build it, which means I need talented entrepreneurs with specific skill sets to get me to that spot. They're, if they have a good idea, typically able to raise funding. If it's a good idea, at this point, there's a lot of venture capital money in town. And I think that's one thing to recognize for those growth businesses New York has done really well is because we have this reputation of having a great tech sector, it's been celebrated publicly by the public sector. That helps draw money. And so that helps sort of put a buzz around New York City as a good place as an investor to come and put your money to work.
Great. Cliff, what would you like to add?
Well, I would say I moved to New York in the 1980s from Ohio, and I remember moving here, and I lived below 14th Street, came here to go to NYU Law School before I started my businesses. And I remember not seeing any children for the first 7 years that I lived here in the 1980s. I didn't know, I didn't see any families. Now I'm sure that there were families here, but this was, New York was a bit of a grittier place. And I remember at that time thinking what I was going to do, whether I was going to stay in New York or not. And then I stopped being a lawyer in the late 80s and started my company in 1990. And started a family shortly thereafter. And the kinds of decisions that my wife and I made in terms of staying here were very key to sort of schools and lifestyle and quality of life and all of those things. I think much of the debate, and as a result of staying here, I've started a few companies and employed a number of people. And if I hadn't sort of had what I needed in New York, I would have gone somewhere else, like was said. I think that so much of the debate seems to be characterized as sort of a Wall Street real estate interest versus the interest of workers. And when I think about sort of the people who live in New York and sort of who's, and what makes New York, there's a huge group of people who I think are left out of that conversation. And one of the reasons that I've been working a little bit with Kathy is because I think the people who sort of are not in either of those places and are starting businesses and want to stay in New York and are committed to the city are not really part of that debate. And I think that they certainly, other than the tech sector, which I think has done a good job in many ways of advocating for themselves over the last year, I don't think they were really much a part of the debate of the last election. And when I'm here, I have, right now we have about 70 employees, and they're exactly the kind of employees that you want to have in New York. They're not making huge amounts of money, but they're making enough money to live here, and they have growth opportunities. And these are talented people who have great upside, and people like me want to stay here and want to build our companies here. But I think that some of the challenges that we face get more into, I would say, policies that are planned for maybe larger companies and trying to addressing larger societal issues through things like whether it's sick leave, whatever sorts of issues are passed through the city council that are introduced that are sort of taken with the interest of we're either going to help workers or we're either going to choose workers or large companies. There's a lot of people like me who are sort of in the middle. And these policies, often they come in and it's not just at the city level, it's the state and federal level. And just for whatever it's worth, I'm a progressive Democrat who's been involved in numerous campaigns, and I'm very sympathetic to many of those issues, and I'm there. But as a business owner in New York, a lot of that stuff, the debate seems to me, are we going to either have this policy that helps a worker, or are we going to take the side of Goldman Sachs? There's a whole bunch of people like me who are affected by a lot of those policies, who have more than 50 employees, and who don't really have any voice in that. And I would just encourage you, when you're thinking about the policies you're going to be pursuing over the next 4 years, that you think that we get into that conversation a little bit. My employees all get plenty of sick leave, and I don't want to start that conversation. That's not. No, but honestly, I don't want to start that conversation because that's not the primary issue, and I'm not even weighing in on that. I'm just simply saying that conversation and that debate over the last 2 years has happened without anybody from my world in that debate. So I think that, that's worth having. The last thing I would say is that all of those lifestyle things that I think make the city more livable and which are sometimes viewed as kind of catering to, groovy, bearded people from Brooklyn or whatever, actually have a significant impact on whether companies that are growing and want to stay here want to hire people who respond to that and will, instead of going to Austin, whatever, will stay here. And those things are really important. They're not just superficial, like let's let another bunch of 27-year-olds ride their bike around town. They mean something. So.
Stuart, you wanted to add something?
I'll be brief. I wasn't just going to point out that not all groovy bearded people live in Brooklyn. And I'm not going to get into the debate on paid sick leave. I'm also not quite sure if we really need to see a dichotomy. I think what we need to try to do is try to bring everyone together with shared objectives. But I do want to point out what the partnership has taught me is some of the vulnerabilities of our economy that I think we should always keep in mind. One is the skills gap that we referred to already that has left many people behind in this innovation economy. An aging and inadequate infrastructure, a shortage of affordable housing, and the concentration of poverty and joblessness in certain economically distressed communities. And I think that those issues have to be part of our thinking when we deal with economic development.
And that's all in the business-sponsored blueprint that we handed out to you. So we practice what we preach here.
Yeah,
1 second, Kyle.
I was just going to say, going to something Stuart said at the beginning about people coming together and recognizing that they are at the end of the day on the same page. Too often the discussion is about what the wage is that someone, and I think that's an important discussion to have, but I think and if you are thinking about the actual core issue, and if I could say one thing to the incoming city council, it's that the real issue is about mobility and skills acquisition. And the idea, too often we're focused on, and I'm not saying it's important or not important, about what the benefits are and what the wage is of somebody working at Target. And I think that the real issue, I'm just using that as an example, I think the real issue is potentially that, but also what skills and what training is that person going to get so that they can go to a different job or take advantage of what's going on in the innovation economy or take advantage of whatever economy is next in New York City, and that they can have the ability, if they would like to move on to a job with a different level of skills, at a more nuanced style of training and taking advantage of their core assets. So I would encourage you to think about the issue of mobility, skills acquisition, the ability of taking advantage of it's poverty, the poverty issue, for
Stuart's
example.
point,
Yeah.
that's very much what
Very
the
much,
unions,
yeah.
whether it's 1199 or the hotel unions, the retail unions, very much what they focus on is a mobility training thing, and sometimes that really does get lost in the conversation.
does,
I think
yeah.
that's a very good point. Maria, quickly, and then Andrew.
Another thing to remember too is the growth industries of the future are not showing up in your offices because they're not here yet, right? So when people come in to sort of ask for incentives or they want some help, sometimes that is an industry that's old. And just remember that the growth sectors are often not here yet, not talking to you. And so sort of
hold on to what they already
right,
have.
yeah. So sort of be mindful of that.
Government's job should not be keeping dead companies
Yeah.
alive.
You want to sort of
You
think about
you cannot win.
no.
There's never enough public money or public tax incentives to keep dead companies alive. And I can tell you chapter and verse of how much of our economic development money over the past decades has gone to that purpose, rather than retraining people for the jobs of the future, to keep those jobs there, but not. Andrew, you
Just 2 quick points. I think a lot of the jobs of the future are here, but they're with companies that have 500 square feet or 1,000 square feet. They're very, very small. And that's where we have an enormous problem with affordability in this city. So there's a waiting list of 100 businesses trying to get in the Navy Yard. There's explosive pressure on Class B and C space now in Manhattan. Those companies need opportunities in Brooklyn, in Queens, in the Bronx to grow. And that's where we have the kinds of cool old buildings that these entrepreneurs want to be in. They don't want to be in the office towers of the 70s, number one. Number two, going to your blueprint, which was awesome, and I want to focus the council members on that.
He's brought,
Is, there's a very simple recommendation in there, but that is really visionary, is to create tech campuses in the outer boroughs and integrate schools with businesses together. And CUNY's done a lot of good work around this, but you all need to keep the pressure on CUNY to keep their schools focused on where are their graduates going to go to work locally and how do they link with them through internships now to prepare people, and then how do we plug high schools into that mix also and have them embedded in the colleges, again linking to businesses that are right here.